A very good morning to all. Today we are gonna take Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser. If you notice, the name Faerie Queene, spelling itself is different. Instead of F-A-I-R-Y, the spelling goes F-A-E-R-I-E. And instead of Q-U-E-E-N, the spelling goes Q-U-E-E-N-E. That shows the impact of Old English, or rather that shows the difference between Old English and New English. Written by Edmund Spenser. The year 1552 he was born, and he met his death on 1599. I'm Manila. Let's go on to the slide. But obvious, this is Edmund Spenser, how he looked like. About his life. Edmund Spenser was born in East Smithfield, London, round the year 1552, though there is some ambiguity as to the exact date of his birth. As a young boy, he was educated in London at the Merchants Taylor School and matriculated as a sizar at Pembroke College, Cambridge. In July 1580, Spenser went to Ireland in the service of the newly appointed Lord Deputy Arthur Grey, 14th Baron Grey de Wilton, though he served with the English force during the Second Desmond Rebellion. After the defeat of the native Irish, he was awarded land in County Cork that had been confiscated in the Munster plantation during the Elizabethan conquest of Ireland. In the year after being driven from his home, Spenser travelled to London, where he died in distressed circumstances. Aged 46, he was arranged for his coffin to be carried off by other poets, which they threw many pens and pieces of poetry into his grave with many tears. This shows how much he was loved by his fellow people. Spenser, as we all should be knowing, was called Poet's Poet and was admired by William Wordsworth, John Keats, Lord Byron, and Alfred Lord Tennyson, among others. The language of his poetry is purposely archaic, reminiscent of earlier works such as the Canterbury Tales and of Geoffrey Chaucer and El Canonnier of Francisco Petrarch, whom Spenser greatly admired. To an extent, we can also identify that this Faerie Queene has some kind of relation, or rather the story structure in which Faerie Queene goes has somewhere linked or has a kind of resemblance with Chaucer's Canterbury Tale. The reason why, because here it's also like in Canterbury Tales, Chaucer tries to narrate stories by the pilgrims. Here he tries to narrate the adventures of knights and thereby glorifying them. Queen Elizabeth, the picture, about whom the whole poem is all about. Some facts. The first three books of the Faerie Queene were published in 1590 and then republished with book 5, 4 and through 6 in 1596. In 1590, the Faerie Queene's book 1 to 3 and 1596, the Faerie Queene book 4 to 6 was published, and posthumously, means after his death in 1609, two cantos of Mutability published together with a reprint of the Faerie Queene. This is the the layout of the book, where you can see written by Edmund Spenser with a glossary explaining the old and obscure words in 2 volumes, volume the first. The Faerie Queene, the whole epic poem, can be called as an allegory. Why? Because the title character, the Faerie Queene herself, is meant to represent Queen Elizabeth first. Red Cross, the characters, I'm talking about the characters, whoever can be seen in the poem. Red Cross represents the individual Christian on the search of holiness who is armed with faith in Christ, the shield with the bloody cross. He is traveling with Una, whose name means truth. For a Christian to be holy, he must have true faith, and so the plot of Book 1 mostly concerns the attempt of evildoers to separate Red Cross from Una. Now you need to remember about the historical aspect before getting into the poem. The reason why, because in the 16th century when Queen Elizabeth was ruling over England, we could understand that there was a great kind of rivalry between Christians themselves, because they were categorized into Catholics and Protestants. Because at some point, when you might be knowing the history of like Bloody Mary, I mean, she was Mary the Queen, but then she was said as Bloody Mary. The reason, because she was the reason because of many bloodshed occurrence in England. And because here Christian means the Protestants, and the Catholics, they have a kind of rivalry between Christian, Protestants and Catholics, which is being highlighted to a greater extent in the poem as well. Book 1 was all about a true Christian finding his truth, and in book 2 and 3 of Faerie Queene, which was published as I told you earlier in 1590, includes an appendix reprinting Spenser's letter to Sir Walter Raleigh, in which he explains his original intention in writing the Faerie Queene. Spenser wished to write a specifically English poem, thereby creating a great national literature to glorify both England and the Queen. His stated purpose was to emulate the accomplishment of such classic epic writers as Homer and Virgil. Book 4, 5 and 6, which was published in 1596, he includes a reference of his own marriage to his second wife Elizabeth Boyle. In book 6 of the Faerie Queene, he represents himself as the shepherd calling cloth, a reference to his earlier pastoral poetry. Now, what is a pastoral poetry? You all may be remembering the pastoral poetry means the poem which is written on in form of lamentation. It's a lamenting poem on the death of a fellow shepherd. That means the layout or the background, or rather the theme, can be said as would be, the setting would be of a land where shepherds do leave their sheep to graze, and there they might be sitting and they might be lamenting about their fellow shepherd, the loss of their friend shepherd. So somewhere like that, shepherd calling cloud, where he represents himself. And this poetry was written when he plays his pipes in celebration of the women he loves. There is a twist, because in Milton's Pastoral Elegy, you may be knowing that Lycidas, he tries to lament on the death of his fellow shepherd. On the other hand, here the setting would be pastoral, but the theme is on lamentation, or rather celebration of the woman whom he loves. He is dreaming about, or rather he is thinking about his lady love, and he is playing his pipe thinking about her. Spenser's allegorical treatment of the political conflicts in Ireland in book 5 may have been motivated by his own experiences as a representative of the British monarchy who lived for some 20 years in Ireland. This book 5 impact, has been said, is about the political conflict in Ireland, because he himself was living in Ireland in those days, and the kind of impact of political turmoil among the people, or among the which influenced the life of the common people, could be very much understood by him in the very first hand. That was the reason why he chose to write about the conflicts in Ireland in his book 5. To speak about the plot, the Faerie Queene is set in the fictional fairy land ruled by Queen Gloriana, an allegorical figure for Queen Elizabeth I, representing the quality of glory. He was trying to glorify England, as been earlier said. His real intention was to glorify England and the Queen, and for that, the very fictional allegorical element what he tries to put is, instead of the name Elizabeth I, he names her Gloriana. Spenser's original plan for the Faerie Queene was to write 12 books, each narrating the adventure of a different knight and focused on a particular virtue. Now, what he was intending, just like Chaucer, the main purpose of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was to feel less burden of traveling while they were getting into the church or the Canterbury Shrine. Here, what Spencer wants to show is he is trying to represent different knights like who can bravely fight for some noble virtue, and he was supposed to write 12 books on such part, but unfortunately he was not able to write 12. We know. In the beginning of the epic, 12 knights will be gathered at the annual feast of the Faerie Queen, where each was to be assigned a quest. Quest is a search for something. Spencer's intention was to make Prince Arthur, representing the quality of magnificence, the central character running throughout all 12 books. Although critics agree that Arthur's role in the narrative of the Faerie Queen does not fulfill this plan. Because 12 books were supposed to write, expected to be written, and different warriors or different knights were supposed to go for a quest, thereby giving some certain insight on some certain kind of virtues, but that was not possible. That why the plot lacks somewhere on especially Arthur's role, because he was expected by Spencer to be the main character to be seen in throughout 12 books. Scholars confirm that Spencer certainly intended for Gloriana and Arthur to be married in Book 12. By the time of Spencer's death, he had published Book 1 to 6 and left a fragment that was published posthumously as the Mutability Cantos in 1609. Many of the same characters and storylines recur throughout the Faerie Queen. This complex narrative scheme is known as interlacement or interlacing narratives. Again, the Queen Elizabeth, as per Spencer, were supposed to get married by Arthur in book 12, which didn't happen because he was able to complete till book 6 only, and then a Mutability Cantos was published posthumously after his death, like 1599. After 1599 it was being published. Each book within the Faerie Queen is further subdivided into cantos. While the cantos was a traditional Italian literary device, Spencer was the first English poet to use it effectively. From his epic tale, Spencer invented his own stanza form, now known as the Spenserian stanza. It consists of 9 iambic lines. The rhyme pattern of the Spenserian stanza is AB, AB, BC, BC, C. Spenserian poem with special reference to the Faerie Queen. It's a courtesy book. 6 books exhibit the virtues of holiness, temperance, chastity, friendship, justice, courtesy. It's a romantic epic which involves adventure and marvels. It can be claimed as a national epic which celebrates the Tudor, Queen England and the English nation. Now, what is Tudor England or what is the story behind that, we are going to learn later in slides. Into the plot, into the theme, the hero of book 1 is Red Cross Knight, also referred as St. George, the patron saint of England. During the course of his adventures, the Red Cross Knight acquires the virtue of holiness. Una, a young woman, travels to the court of the Faerie Queen to ask for help in defeating a dragon that threatens her parents. This is the picture of Una with the lion, and Una, as been said, represents truth. Una there obtains the aid or the help of the Red Cross Knight, temporarily held captive by the villainous Dusa. The Red Cross Knight is rescued by King Arthur and goes on to defeat the dragon. At the end of book 1, Una and the Red Cross Knight are married. There shows the virtue of holiness. Here you can have a symbolic element as being which has already been said, like a red cross represents Christ, search of Christian, a young Christian, that is Red Cross Knight, and Una represents truth. That depicts, like, if at all a true Christian, or if at all a person wants to be a true Christian or defined to be a true Christian, he should follow the path of truth, and only then he can get into achievement, or he can be one with God. At the same time, it is also being depicted that there might be many falsehood coming on the way, and if you get digressed in the tone, or if you get digressed with the false element coming in your way, you cannot achieve your oneness with God. That is being depicted, means somewhere again a political kind of turmoil is being depicted. Book 2 features the hero Gyon, who represents the virtue of temperance. After being rescued by Arthur, Gyon travels to the Bower of Bliss, a garden of delight representing the temptation of sensual pleasure. There, Gyon defeats the villainous Arcasia, who would seduce man and turns them into beasts. Again, in book 2, the same kind of impact. King Arthur appears in book 1, King Arthur appears in book 2 as well. Both the places where the protagonist or the character or the hero who is finding himself in a kind of situation where he cannot help himself, Arthur appears and helps. At the same time, in temperance, again he shows that there might be many kind of temptations coming around, which should be reduced or which should be eradicated. Only then we would be able enough to achieve the virtue of temperance. And in book 3, which tells of the adventure of Britomart, a female knight who represents the virtue of chastity. Britomart